of Debt Nation. I'm your host, Steel Archer, and we are busy putting death out of business. And before we run into this episode, really want to thank our sponsors. That's Thrivous. Remember, $5 all the way up to $160 when you share this episode out. Kane and Zion, you can do this as well. Everyone's entitled to some free Thrivous. I'm telling you, my friend is my roommate has trialing Thrivous right now, and he says it's fantastic. And you go on the website, look at the open source mechanism of Thrivous. Look at the reviews. Look at the website. It is fantastic, and I really highly recommend everybody go out and get some Thrivous. Share this link around. I think you guys will do really well. And thanks also to David Kelly from the I Am Transhuman campaign for sponsoring this episode of Debt Nation. Look, listen. South Carolina, the Dems, they're all battling it out. They're fighting it out. It's very exciting. This wasn't as exciting as the former debate because, for example, the Elizabeth Warren shell shock moment, it's gone. She had a stab at Biden again with the same thing, but didn't really work this time. Bernie Sanders looking strong. Everybody's attacking Bernie. Buttigieg he's just sort of playing the Macronian type. Intellectual liberal and doing quite well. Biden getting angry that he kept getting cut off and then trying to act all Trumpian and Obamian and, assert his authority during the debate. There was a lot going on. Let's go to a reaction. First, we'll start off with our political campaign that we're supporting. And remember, 5 days, Chicago, a life-changing event happening in Chicago in 5 days. We've been counting down, very excited for the Chicago debate. It's Ben Zion 2020, everyone. Thanks, Ben, for coming on. Ben, you saw the debate. How was it? What did you say? Recap. Let's go. Thanks, Ben.
Well, yeah. So Bloomberg was again take some pretty heavy hits in this debate. He was characterized again as a racist and somebody who forced someone to terminate a pregnancy or insinuated that be done, and came across as six kinds of bad person besides. But still, because we lived in something rather like a kleptocracy, I would say that Bloomberg is quite likely to be as likely as almost anyone to be the next president in the United States. And that is, I think, why I am not a Democrat or a Republican. I've always been active in third parties. And I think that is the most important takeaway from this exciting and some say ridiculous event of last night, which I will add was the second highest rated in terms of viewership event of this kind after the one from the week past. So a lot of people were watching this. They were all angry that it was kind of a wild event, but they still tuned in. What do you guys think?
Yeah. Joe Biden really wanting to take South Carolina. That was a really obvious factor, going after a lot of different people on the stage there. Kane, what do you say?
There was a lot of senior moments. A lot of senior moments. Bernie didn't seem to have too many, but Joe Biden said that guns had killed 150 million people in the last 10 years in the United States.
Somehow, I don't think that's
approximately 40% of the United States population.
Entirely correct. Yeah. Kane, what do you say? You saw the debate, or you saw the highlights of the debate? I know that much. What do you say, Kane? How do you think it went?
I don't have too strong of an opinion, I think, in terms of their performance. From my perspective, there might be some improved performance, but the Democratic Party looks like it's in total disaster. I've never seen it like this. And they seem to be pulling at both ends of the same rope in a really vicious manner. And I don't see any hope for their leadership, in my honest opinion. I don't see an Obama there. I don't see even a President Carter. I don't see a Ronald Reagan there. I don't see any kind of leader that makes you feel like, as president, they're both going to be pragmatic and uplifting for everyone. And I think that people call that centrist, but I call that optimizing outcomes. And so, mean performances do better than the risks that come from outliers. You can pull to an outlier and maybe you get lucky. You can also end up with twice the losses that you are pursuing in gains. So with all the turmoil in the world, it would be nice to have not just a pragmatic leader, but a charming one that gets people's spirits. I think it's what the Democrat Party, some of them, not all of them, fail to understand. There is something that Trump tapped into. National narratives are extremely important. And the United States gets a really bad rap for something that doesn't exist. If you look at, for example, the average lifespan of a Russian male is about 60. The average lifespan of a Russian female is 70, right? We want to talk about poverty, and we want to talk about all the racist and bigoted tropes towards the U.S. of being this uneducated, unsophisticated place. You want to talk about poverty levels. I think in Austria, it's like 15%, far higher than the United States. And I think the American public know that these narratives, these tropes, these bigoted tropes towards them are wrong. And they want a president to say, F you. And we know this is bullcrap. And we can say this is pathetic and that people shouldn't be susceptible to this and strong, but the bottom line is they are. And humans require self-esteem to function. Mm. And if they're the subject of everybody's tropes, because they are, and then it drags their emotions in the dirt and they don't believe in themselves. It's unfortunate, but that's how every collective identity operates. You can't escape it. I don't think there is one civilization on the world where their national image, it doesn't impact their own sense of self on an average. Now you can find someone who says, oh, I'm an individualist or I'm a crypto bro and I don't care. Okay, fine. But you're not the person, you don't matter. What matters is the mean person, the average. Mm. You are irrelevant. You don't have any importance in the big scheme of things. You're just the sideshow.
Yeah, I like this, and I do think this is because it's kind of funny because every time they try and look strong, so for example, Joe Biden tries to look strong, it's like as if he's trying to imitate Trump. It's become Trump's playpiece, right? So strength is now converted into a Trumpian thing. And then, Elizabeth Warren is too one-sided. She only goes after the rich. She only goes after redistribution policies from megacorps to under, and that doesn't resonate enough with middle America. Bernie Sanders.
Well, there was
the healthcare issue is the problem with Bernie Sanders. It's the healthcare. It's Bernie Sanders has some okay policies and stuff like that, but rewriting the whole American healthcare system from a private to a public system makes it very hard for Sanders to function in the Democratic Party.
I think the proper question for Sanders on the stage should be, are you okay with categorizing the communist sickle as a hate crime to wear it, just like the Nazi symbol? And then watch his reaction. And if he says, I agree with you, it's a demonstration of a hate symbol, then we're talking about something different. But because he has that baggage, that image of being the Che Guevara type and sympathetic to those causes, which is a bit of the antithesis of Americans' 70-year struggle in the Cold War, right? It's a very strange that if people only have so much bandwidth of a thing they can think about of a certain person. But it's important not to forget these parts of their beliefs so that when they are president, suddenly we are not getting something we didn't expect. I think that when Trump became president, there were things that happened that no one expected, or their evidence was there, but people weren't looking at it. And I believe people are what they say. And if Bernie says that he won't condemn the leader of Venezuela, he won't do it as U.S. president either.
I agree.
And this is very concerning. And I think that in many ways, this matter is more important than healthcare. I'll tell you why that is. The U.S. is a global superpower or a global hegemon. If you want to look at historical events of hegemon, and the world is relatively declining. It's not declining. What happens is other countries are getting more wealthy, and there's blood in the water, and the sharks are circling. And it's really essential that this change is carefully managed, and that the U.S. can position itself. Because what will happen is there can be a vacuum of power. There can be many more wars. If they think that the casualties of a couple of million in Iraq was tragic, Where do you see what happens when there is a real vacuum and there are countries invading like Iraq into Kuwait?
You know, I understand what you're saying,
what I'm
Kevin,
getting at is that
about Venezuela, or about Cuba, but at the exact same time that this controversy was going on, the President Trump was in India, glad handing with a right-wing ethno-nationalist strongman in the form of Prime Minister Modi. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a scenario. That's a kind of personality that's at least as dangerous in terms of escalating nuclear war and other things as anybody that we're talking about. Fidel Castro's been dead for 6 years.
Not going to disagree with you there. What's happening in northern India, I think the UN wrote many condemnations about, right? Should be shutting people's internet access off and find a better way to manage the situation. That's a very important point. But I think my view is that the U.S. president should be pragmatic. They should stay true to the values that the U.S. has been following since 1945 onward in the restructuring of the world. And I think that there should be a continuation of those values. It doesn't mean that the U.S. has to go into a war based on a lie. That's not acceptable. But that doesn't mean that you negate that 70 years of value building. You know, the future of the world should be built on people having the same exact constitutional rights that Americans have or Europeans have. The same exact civil liberties and human rights, and enforced and backed and not broken by corruption. And until there is another country that will guarantee those things, U.S. has to hold tight.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to see that from the president. And I want to see them placing that ideology at the top of their tongue every time they talk.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the pre-interview, we talked a little bit about this idea that there are certain kinds of standards of this kind that need to be upheld. And Kevin, we started alluding to the situation in Russia and Austria having economic hardships, and I think it got me to thinking a little bit about China. You know, within the last 72 hours, the market in the U.S. has taken quite a nosedive.
Yeah.
But the market impact in East Asia is orders of magnitude higher, and this is owing to one particular series of events, the COVID-19 concerns.
All right, before we go into the coronavirus, I just want to wrap up and finish on the Democratic debate in South Carolina. Ben, just tell me in a few words, who do you think won? Who do you think's coming strong out of that debate before we move on to COVID-19?
Well, who I think won? I would say that there were polls that said that Buttigieg did really well. You know, he's grandstanding. If Buttigieg and to a lesser degree Klobuchar hadn't been on the stage, it wouldn't have been this kind of insane thing. But he kind of got away with it. There's not most of the polls didn't say that anybody won, except that Biden and Sanders did not lose, which is the case thus far in the rest of this. So I would say that I guess the winners were Biden and Sanders, but again with Warren taking a lot out of Bloomberg.
And the other point I want to make just before we move on is Russiagate 3.0. I'll ask you in a second, Kane. But Russiagate 3.0, it's one of these Democrat things, and the Putin is their master manipulator behind the scenes, managing the U.S. elections. And I mean, Bernie Sanders is now being accused of being a Putin front. I didn't hear either you mention this. What is Putin the master behind Bernie Sanders or any of these Democratic candidates? Starting with Ben and moving on to Kane quickly. Yes or no, Ben?
There's probably some truth to the idea that Trump and Sanders have been supported by outside intelligence agencies and other operators. The extent to which I would tend to say the idea that there was collusion between the former Sanders and Putin would be laughable. The Trump Putin question remains an open question, but it's still a lesser consideration than the overall influence of influence operations, be they spycraft or other, on the U.S. elections. So a short answer: it's a distinct possibility. It seems to be, but I guess I would tend to agree with this Buttigieg assessment, but only this is. If the United States has and many countries have this sort of carefully curated 1- and 2-party systems, wherein Noam Chomsky says we have a vigorous discourse focused around a very small set of things, wedge issues, things that don't necessarily relate to the betterment of the citizenry, and when we're looking at this problem. And outside organizations trying to disrupt that strange clusterfuck, that they're just doing, they're not doing it out of anything else than just trying to take a shot at Hillary Clinton or trying to take a shot at these sort of incestuous powers. And so I don't view that as a valid critique of Sanders or, to a very high degree, Trump.
Kane, Russiagate 3.0, and then who you thought came out strongest, or who you thought won the South Carolina debate?
I'm not going to comment on that. That's okay with you, but I will say about this Russiagate thing. I think the strategy would be that Putin believes that if Bernie wins the nomination, he will lose against Trump, and so that's why Putin support him. That's the unfortunate thing going forward. That I suspect that the Russian GRU trolls will back whoever they think will lose against the candidate that they want. I don't think that Trump is a Manchurian candidate. I don't think that he works for Putin. What I think is because of his policies, they feel it advantageous to them. And that's really what it comes down to. If you want to talk about Manchurian candidates, I would like to hear from Bloomberg an unequivocal condemnation of the Chinese government in public on TV with not middle or warm words, but with cold and brutal, ones.
That was a comment that raised an eyebrow.
From him is because if you go to Bloomberg Asia, every headline is about China. China saved the world by quarantining Wuhan. Watch out for China's rise, and China this and that, and China that. It is like right out of the CCP gave them the headlines. And so because I follow Bloomberg Asia and this very conspicuous thing about comparing coronavirus to the flu, which is also CCP propaganda because they're concerned about the economic impacts. Russia diverted all of its food imports away from trying to close the border. You don't switch back food imports a month later. They're probably 1-year contracts. Whoever is going to be the seller of food to Russia probably said, let's lock this in for 24 months. And then there are derivatives traded around those for hedging and those things for price fluctuations. So that economic damage is permanent, or it's sealed. And I think that China is gambling, or the Chinese leadership are gambling, that they can get it under wraps and not have that economic damage. They're putting one thing before the other. And whatever growth rates we see in South Korea are the exact ones in China. And if they're different, Chinese government's lying.
Well, that's deep. All right, so that's good segue over into the COVID-19 coronavirus debate. That came up in South Carolina. Thank you very much, Kane. And actually, Kane, you open up on this. So what's the latest in the coronavirus issue? I mean, there are alarming stats coming out that there's all different news at the moment. It's peaking, or that 70% of the Earth's population is going to disappear. The Spanish flu, that peaked and that disappeared and it went on to the 1950s. It killed a huge population of people, more than World War One. But it disappeared. What do you say? What about this coronavirus?
This illness, as it exists now, couldn't possibly wipe out.
There are two personality types that utterly scare me. The conspiracy theory ones, that it's a weapon, and then the Dunning-Kruger effect ones that say, oh, it's just a flu. Both of those statements are reckless. So we know a lot about it. We know that it can stay alive on surfaces for 10 days. The flu is 1 day. We know that we don't even know the R0 rate exactly. We know that it's really freaking high. We know that it stays in your poop. and it transmits like that. We know that it might be aerosolized. We know that there are like maybe super carriers. We know a lot about it. So let's assume, for example, it does get to 70% of the population, like that Harvard scientist suggested. What is 1% of 70% of the world? It's 50 million people dead. So let's talk about economics. Or it's 2%. Let's say it's 100 million dead. Depending on where that population is, let's say the 100 million is United States, Europe. Let's say it's OECD, right? Where the most economic activity happens. Then you're talking about economic impact that lasts for decades, loss of demand, also excess capacity of production for no demand. And then people talk, oh, it's older people. I have news for you. Older people are consumers. When people are retired, they buy things. We need them for the economy, you nitwits.
Yep, that's what they save up their whole life for. And yeah, so Ben, you were mentioning the economy, the stock market is on the right. And actually, by the way, before I go over to you, Ben, just for 1 second, I am getting Gregory Mannarino, who is known as the Wolf, not the Wolf, well, the Robin Hood of Wall Street, actually, and he's a good friend of mine, and I'm going to get him on for a really good stock analysis because what I've been saying for years, where the stock market and the real economy are dislocated, is so true now. You're looking at the economy, essentially this just-in-time economy breaking down as the supply chain's breaking down. It's happening here in Australia. The stocks, all the stores are starting to dwindle now for all sorts of parts that are produced in China. That's why we support 3D printing, by the way. CubeSpawn, it's right there. It's a big solution. Crowdfund, do it if you want, or don't, and then you can suffer the consequences.
The supply chain breakdown, I don't think that is going to continue. But that is basically a good way to describe it relative to the U.S. lost some small percentage of the Dow last few days. But the supply chain breakdown is conceivably more across Eurasia is conceivably, and the Pacific is more concerning. But one indicator that may not continue to be the case is that there are now more coronavirus outbreaks in other parts of the world than in China. So that's not the best of the indicators of this, because there are better indicators epidemiologically, but that is a pretty good indicator that this sort of thing might wrap up, say, by summertime instead of next summer, for example, as a serious concern. But the impact. The impact on the Chinese economy is significant, and I think probably there's more to say on that subject. But the fact remains, as Kevin pointed out, that so far about 2,000 plus people have been dead or mortally wounded from this, and that is out of some 80,000 plus that we know of who have been infected, and there doesn't seem to be that growth effect where we're going to see those 50 million people impacted. But this is a moment to discuss these kind of things. We need to have better standards on a number of scores, including how we approach epidemiological countermeasures.
Yeah, do you want to go into any of those countermeasures? So China seems to be buffing up its security and its practices in its labs, for example. That's one thing. The response has been quite astounding. I mean, from China. I mean, authoritarian, yes, but do you think that is acceptable in these circumstances, Ben?
Well, I mean, this was a question that we had in the pre-interview. Because we're all techno-futurists at this table, and to some degree interested in the things that might provoke some kind of post-nationalist institutions. Maybe we have different ideas about strategies therein or comfort levels with those kinds of things. So the question of different types of oversight internationally, or different types of national mechanisms to address that, I think if you're literally looking at 50 million dead people, that's the time to have that conversation. But anytime when you could have something that might challenge people's hyper-nationalist sensitivities that keep them from embracing some kind of post-nationalism or some kind of international collaboration to that end, that's a good time. We can have that conversation now. I think, unfortunately, that's a very difficult conversation to have. Where there's 7.5 billion people in the world, and I think probably 7.49 billion of them would be described as some kind of hyper-nationalist. There's this just really difficult to get people to say, oh yeah, maybe the UN, maybe the CDC, maybe this or that. The people are resistant to that conversation. But this is the time to be having it. And as far as the question of Chinese measures, some of those things seem to be reasonably restrained, not in the PR department, but in the actual epidemiological countermeasure department. I don't know. What do you think, Kevin?
I think that we should be a bit frightened. If I were working for a terror group, I'd want to get a hold of this naturally occurring thing, release it in the impoverished country that wants to be the subject of my torment. I think that people should be afraid, and that we have to take international action to increase the regulation over the research around these things. I think that they are a time bomb, as Bill Gates and other people have said before we face a pandemic, and humanity should take it seriously. For someone to be excited about that because of population control or overpopulation, to be excited about that first is the conduct of a psychopath. So there is nothing exciting about people dying. And number two, we are on the cusp of innovations that make it so that we can afford to have a much larger population than the one we have on Earth, with fusion quantum computers and other things that we can go into that you all know that make it possible. So it is very realistic that human innovation will make these problems of overpopulation manageable. But what can wreck the entire train is Mother Nature, of course. Right, so it's done that in history, and I think there is a reason why most of the world condemns any kind of research for making bioweapons and stuff like that, and this needs to be reasserted. I'm sure the Russians and everyone else is on the same page, and maybe there should be some regulating bodies and some transparency imposed on China, transparency imposed, overruling their sovereignty when it comes to the management of things that can wreak havoc on the world when it comes to their research on that. I think that it should not be within the sovereign right of a country to tinker with things that can wipe out humanity.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the world comes down heavy on chemical weapons and biological weapons. They invade countries for that sort of stuff. Whether that's real or fabricated, people do not like that. Saddam Hussein, I remember, rightly or wrongly, was accused of that, and the world came down hard on that. And
I want to echo, and we've said it on this program before, but I want to echo what Kevin said, that this particular area of epidemiology is the area where risks are increasing relative to these other human created existential risks, nuclear weaponry, and the others that you just mentioned, because the price point for creating a CRISPR bioweapon is reduced every year, and so that just any troubled person or bumbling person could create something that's very dangerous. It's what Eliezer Yudkowsky refers to as Moore's law of mad scientists. The IQ points required to destroy humanity comes down by one every year. It's a joke, but it's also kind of true. And I think it does call back the discussion that we had about, I know people in this movement who are staunch supporters of something like a secular one world government that is technologically mediated, and probably by most people's estimation relative to nation states of the day, more minarchist. And but that's a really hard sell to people. Again, like, people really love nationalism; they love it, and so some kind of cosmopolitan alternative is an incredibly unpopular opinion, even if it is something that would mediate existential risks to some degree or other.
I think, if you don't mind my adding, the definition of nationalism as I define it is identifying yourself by the collective success of the other people you live with. I think there are different layers of identity. So maybe I imagine myself an entrepreneur first. And so when I'm out in public, I think that's who I am. Or maybe it's the former military veteran, or maybe it's a person who writes about metaphysics. And there's always a rank of those things in my mind of who I am. So if when I'm in South Korea, people ask me all the time if I'm American. So maybe that part of my identity is more on my mind, right? And so I think that nationalism is a problem when at the top of your mind all the time is that you're proud of what everyone else has done. And I'll tell you the problem with it is that when the image of everyone else goes down, then you go down. And, if there's a big scandal in Beijing, or there's a big scandal in Iran, and if they're very nationalistic people, then they will be raging up and down all the time from these events. Well, I think so it's for mental health, it's important to be an individualist. I think that nationalism and collectivism are near neighbors, because they both bind your self-esteem to the acts of people you can't control, which makes for very volatile personalities. That's why there's the image of nationalists being these raging, like raging animals with rabid animals, because their emotions are so volatile because they have no control. And then nationalism always leads to authoritarianism. So does collectivism, because in order to get yourself under control, your self-esteem, you have to control everyone else more and more. And so I think that, if my shocking moment for today is the new communism, the new Nazism is nationalized collectivism. It's the same. It'll do the same damage. It'll cut through the world like a knife through hot butter.
Well, I don't see the dynamics of the networked world really operating that way. By and large, the way that the sort of blogosphere and the newsphere has emerged, it's really been it doesn't look like that. And also, we're kind of talking about two different classes of problem here, and I'll call it back to a religious similarity in religion. So people, when they criticize religion, they say, well, a religion is bad because it could lead to this sort of geopolitical this sort of empire that existed in the Middle Ages with Christianity or Islam. But that's not really. It's possible, but it's not really that likely to be the outcome at the end of the 21st century. But I think the more important criticism for the 21st century of these ideas is that religion is a kind of a worthless gatekeeper preventing a better class of institution from supplanting it. And we could say the exact same thing about hyper-nationalist sentiments and the various institutions that they protect. It's a money pit that humanity's limited resources are being shoveled into, rather than focusing on a better class of institution and solving grand human challenges. We're all caught up in just sports fandom on a geopolitical scale.
I think that it's not that simple. I don't think it's because people are stupid. I think that they're nationalistic because they think that that's how they maximize their benefit the most in a resource-scarce world. The price, like I said, they choose to pay that. And their price is their mental self-esteem and sanity, because they're going to go up and down with the country themselves personally. But they're not foolish. We live in a resource scarce world. There is not enough for everyone right now. It would take, I think I read, 8 planet Earths of natural resources for China to have the same middle class as the US. That's not sustainable. And so their leaders are very rational in preparing for a fight because they know this. The option, the way out is, of course, breakthroughs in quantum computing, because then we can master all kinds of innovations around materials we never imagined. And then nuclear fusion right after. And then we have water, we have costless water desalination, irrigation for farming, everything. It is amazing. And we can talk about a post-national world only after we have resource abundance, because it's very irrational to change now. And I have some further things. People underestimate cultural difference. I want to talk about that real briefly. People think cultural difference is weddings and food and praying. That's not cultural difference. Cultural difference is like whether you respect the contract or not in law. So when I was in Northeast Asia, it's often a frequent problem that you sign a contract and then people say, well, you know, and then it's not really. And the legal system kind of is like that. So contracts are not immutable in lots of parts of the world. And so for me, that's very frustrating. I never want to live in a world like that. So when I came back to the US, for example, I want to be sure to back this horse, because the only world I could ever imagine living in is where a contract is immutable. Unless there is some extraordinary circumstance with the clear due process, but it cannot be because a month later you say it's not fair because you were playing a game and you were hoping to get a little bit more later, but you didn't play your hand early. And these kind of behaviors are big cultural differences, right? And you can't just merge people and think it's going to work out like that. It's going to be ingrained. The people will be violent.
Yeah, right? I agree with this. Yeah. I agree with this notion. I think that's why I like technology, because I think that we live in a world that is limited. It's limited on many, many fronts, and we need to unlimit it via the technological revolutions. And I think that's the real problem, isn't it? Because we live in this scarcity. We live in a world where all of this geopolitics actually flows on, and it impacts people and markets and incentive structures and the way we think. I did accidentally delete myself from the screen. I brought myself back up as an avatar. Sorry about that. That's your fault, Ben. I will say that. But Ben, what do you want to say? You were objective.
Well, you know, I think that to some degree we're talking about also an inability of all of us collectively to kind of see the freakonomics of things, to see the hidden costs of some of these institutions. And you know what? I'll bring it back to the futurist community for a moment. In a bit of a non sequitur, but this is something that's been on my mind recently. No, I don't think that if I'm not mistaken, no one here has a cryonics contract. So maybe I won't be stepping on your toes too directly. But if we look at life extension outcomes like cryonics and the actual basic resurrection that would have to occur for a cryonics contract to be ultimately fulfilled, there's other alternatives. So let's say that solving that problem, that's $1 trillion problem. $1 trillion of R&D could go into solving that problem. There's other sort of something akin to reanimation that could be $1 billion problems. So, for example, the Italian scientist who's planning to do this head transplantation, he says that surgery itself could cost $100 million. So let's say that the sort of cloning and head transplantation approach to the same problem, physically extending your life by some significant number of years, that could be something that would cost $10 billion instead of many hundreds of billions of dollars of R&D. Somewhere in between there would be something like some brain in the jar technology that would have to be wholly developed in terms of the protocols, but would probably be cheaper than fulfilling anybody's cryonics contract. But the point, aside from getting into techno-futurist, popular technobabble, the point is that people really are not good at looking at institutions and the way that they are what they're costing them and how well they're functioning. It's really something that we're bad at. Like, some people are good at it. Like, People who really make a study of it, or people who seem to have this natural ability, like Bill Gates seems to be pretty good at it. But ordinary people just don't really have neurons firing that way, and I think that this, if we did have a different kind of literacy in this area, we might. I literally believe that this problem that I've described of hypernationalism and a lack of international cooperation is, in a word, the biggest existential risk that we have to overcome if we as a species are to survive the 21st century. But I think that we're going to have like 100 million people die in a pandemic or a war for people to even start to consider those concerns.
I have a model to attempt to explain the current state of the world, the Black Swan event of a big rise in populism. So Duterte, Erdogan, and across all these leaders, and India, Modi, and the fanatics, and the hard right. And it's not because of people being better at propaganda. It's not because of the Republicans or because of Trump or because of the Dems or because of social media. The model that I want to propose to you is because people can observe that there is a looming power vacuums around the world as the U.S. loses ironclad grip hold on the sea lanes in the world. And so they also recognize, subconsciously or consciously, that there is looming resource scarcity. And so they have a choice. Hard, cut off, and fight and grab something now, or everybody go all in and cooperate. But we know from the prisoner's dilemma, the first instinct and temptation.
I totally agree with your analysis, Kane. That's how, because like, especially being, I mean, you spent your time in South Korea, and you know how it feels like to be an exposed country out there in the big world. I mean, I live out here in Australia, and it's different. It's very different from when you're actually in America, because you're so isolated and so secure, and you've got NAFTA, and you've got all the economic security. But out here, I mean, it's all about resource scarcity. It's all about who can grab as much as you can, and that's it's like that nationalism is your first response. It's the first responder, and that's kind of a default notion. Whether that's good or bad or not or what, that's left up to debate. Obviously, Ben thinks that's bad, but and you have a different.
I think losers from it. That's the problem, because there's not enough room for everyone. And if they're going to go ahead and kick off a fight, some people are going to lose, and it might be the one that was sure they're going to win the fog of war. Not all war has to have guns. There's a cyber war. Yeah. The Chinese government's conducting cyber terrorism every day. You know, with the leak of Equifax of people's personal data, I consider that an act of terror, because you're bringing personal harm to those people. And I'll tell you why it's terror. It's not just a hubris. I define terrorism as targeting civilians in order to impact public sentiment so they steer their government differently. Terrorism is not collateral damage. Terrorism is not dropping a bomb on a convoy and accidentally killing someone next door. It's a travesty. But terrorism is trying to put fear into the public so that they go to their policymakers. And when your cyber attacks are directly targeting the public, 70% of all world cyber attacks target the American people themselves. 70% of all world target the people, the civilians, a lot of them. And when you target civilians, it's terrorism.
Yep. Yeah, I totally agree. But there is a notion in here that Ben uses, and I'm not sure where he got it from, whether he invented it or whether, but techno-sluggishness, and this is something I subscribe to. It's something I subscribe to, Ben, and this is why we love you here at the show, because it does answer a lot of these solutions, like Kane was saying, to bring you out from that winner-take-all mindset, and which is where we're at right now. And it's not just that technology is evolving slowly; it's that it's not being distributed in the correct way, and it's not being formulated in a way that's useful for the future navigation of these geopolitical and human and societal and economic and environmental issues. It's not being funneled in the right way. It's being funneled in a topsy-turvy direction, sometimes by the military-industrial complex, which does make some innovations and progress, but there is a lot of innovations and progress inside of that huge mechanism of creation that is misdirected. What do you say, Ben?
Yes, yes. Well, I do think that techno sluggishness, and I don't exactly know who's coined that term. It could be me, but certainly the concept is it's not novel. It's not terribly novel. But this is the best way of thinking about the crafting of economic policies. Is in this specific situation, whatever economic policy you're talking about, is this policy going to hinder techno progress or advance techno progress? And so not every question in my view breaks down along right or left, so to speak, economic policies when looking at those things. But I want to say, just in defense of collectivism, that the political landscape, even compared to 5 decades ago in living memory, and now it's if you just force someone into a time machine from 5 decades ago, and you ask them to consider the politics of today, they would be very confused and upset. And also, every one of us, this is a joke that I like to make. Every one of us is literally by ancestral DNA analysis 6 generations removed from incest and cannibalism. Nobody is not related to an incestuous cannibal to a relatively high degree. So the idea that there is a human nature, that's, no one's used that term in this, but it's a silly one. We have an incredibly versatile dynamic in the human species, and we can very quickly adapt to, for example, this sort of this auxiliary form of governance that was proposed in a recent podcast on here, wherein there's the nation state remains, but there is some sort of second. That was actually on the Roan Horn show. I apologize, but
I want to. So the message is not lost in the definition of collectivism. So it doesn't mean that you don't love. So, in my house, if there is a fire across the street, because I am a loving person, I will go help. Maybe risk my life, maybe not. Hopefully, I do the right thing and risk my life to help those people, right? But my self-esteem is not impacted by whether that family over there are jerk-offs or not, or their kid gets all A's. It's irrelevant to my own self-confidence, right? They don't represent me. If I'm overseas and someone said your president's a moron, and I'll just shrug my shoulders. But I'm not a moron, so who cares? That's individualism, right? But I pragmatically, back to you ask, because its passport is powerful, and I think its ideals are are definitely better than the alternatives put forward by China and Russia. So. And that's the other thing, is that, of course, I like my liberties, and I like to say F off to the president on social media, and I should do it without consequence, because that's just comfortable for me. It's not about right or wrong. It's a selfish thing. But being against collectivism doesn't mean you don't believe in helping people and coming together as a community. What it means is that my self-esteem is not contingent upon the performance of everyone else, because that is very deadly to my self-esteem and to everyone else's, and it makes for a very volatile population.
Conceivably. I mean, these sound like concerns of a lower order of magnitude than things could be devastating to.
But that's where you get your foot soldiers for drums of war, right? It starts with this. It starts with this, right? Because their pride is hurt. Pride is a very dangerous thing to hold dear, right?
I mean,
I agree.
I think the only difference that we have is the extent to which those kind of sentiments and capriciousness generally is something that is wholly typical of the human race. I think that it's something that we can overcome.
For me, it's a caution. It's not about what's better or not. I think that the foot soldiers for the wheels of war are best rallied around that kind of collectivism, right? Because it's very easy to do it, because people's self-esteem can only improve if the country improves. Well, you get a despot for a leader then.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of mechanisms of populism besides the drums of war, or other groundswell effects besides the drums of war. But it is, yeah. I mean, we were just talking about how we kind of live in a world of cyber war, a world where there's not necessarily a huge loss of life in conflicts of this kind.
Not yet.
Yeah,
But
I think that in some ways, we're talking about 20th century dynamics and concerns, and relating and calling back periods of history and historical analogs that are not as relevant today. But
for ethical reasons, we don't discuss the details. All three of us can come up with a scenario where a cyber attack murders 1 million people in a number of months. They're very possible, but I think it's not appropriate to discuss them. But people who really specialize in this understand that. So I think wars can be won in the future without firing a shot through the cyberspace. And it's very frightening, I think.
I think we might leave that there. I might switch over to London for a second. I might go to London. You ready? We're going to London. All right, we're in London. So look, I might just leave it there. I did lose a bunch of stuff, but this has been a fascinating debate, and we want to just thank everybody for coming on today to talk about the South Carolina Democratic debate and some further issues. I mean, it's scary. The coronavirus issue is really scary, and as Zoltan Itzvan tweeted, he said that if he was president, this wouldn't be happening because there would be a lot more resources funneled into science and technology and preventative medicines. So it wouldn't have occurred like that.
Well, let me ask. With the coronavirus thing, one last question for Kevin.
Sure.
My friend, she's a Kiwi. She was raised in China, and she's got a U.S. She's lived in the U.S. for a very long time. She's just gone back to New Zealand because she thinks that it's a little too dangerous to be in New York. She thinks that could be the next place where the coronavirus takes off. Should she stay in New Zealand, Kevin? Should she come back to New York?
I'm no expert, but I'm a little bit concerned about the coronavirus in the U.S. in a very densely populated place like that, and attempts to imagine that if I follow my mom's remedy at home with lemon juice, and that I will be fine, and you won't be. Yeah. So
I think she'll end up being there for another 6 weeks.
I prefer people to be leaning on the side of caution and fear as opposed to downplaying it, because there is just too much at stake. I mean, if we've seen what it did in South Korea, it's just ridiculous growth. And if some carrier walks through every street of New York, because you can walk the whole city, and that is very scary. So I don't know. Maybe being on a farm is not a horrible idea, but I think that
Kane, what do you think about? You're talking about carriers and using it as a biological weapon. Just quickly, I want to get your reaction to the Iranian health minister coming down with coronavirus. Iran is under a maximum pressure campaign. That's what the State Department is saying. Do you think that's coincidental?
Well, he's the health minister, so I'm going to guess he has contact with health professionals who have contact with the virus. So at least there is a logical. We can come up with a logical scenario where it happened by accident, and that's it.
Cool.
I don't think it's a weapon. I want to back up about this. It's not a weapon at all. It is naturally occurring. I have a friend who renewed all the DNA. There is no evidence of any kind of insertions at all or nothing. Yeah. It's natural. But it doesn't mean that you can't take something natural and wreak havoc with it if you wanted to, if you're some maniac. And I think that's the scary part, is that copycats and this kind of stuff. Maybe it'll happen. There'll be some moron in China trying to find the bat cave because they're angry. Like I remember in Korea, there was this suicidal guy who went and burned down the main Dongdaemun gate. He was angry. So we do have to treat these things very seriously, and they do need to be regulated, and we do need to be vigilant in it, because every society has their maniacs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of Korea and maniacs, there was that the Korean outbreak is tied to a religious sect.
That's that's the point. Like they're in Korea, these religious sects. There's actually one Westerner who manages a blog of all of them, and he had a book. So there's one gentleman, the English speaker, who documented all of them better than anyone. It's really remarkable. I can find him. I think we're connected on Facebook because I lived in Korea 10 years, and they're if you want to learn the art of sales, like these people are remarkable. Just they're horrible human beings, and they want a lot of them in prison, but. It's a really peculiar thing that Korea has that, and it's unfortunate that this cult. Every culture has their anomalies. In Korea's is they have Christian cults, and that's their own thing. It didn't come from Europe or the U.S. That's their own anomaly. The way they do that.
They're also a lot more transhumanist in their approach to. Techno-utopian outcomes and or life extension than the average person in the U.S. So it's a little bit like Russia in that regard.
Koreans kind of like that Shirikyo guy in Japan when they did the gas attack in the subway. There are apocalyptic people that out there that endorse this sort of behavior, and it is up to the governments to protect us from them. And I think that's very important. That's what the national security complex is for. That's what we pay taxes for us. But that's the thing. That's the whole debate about the United Nations. How high does it go? Where does the policing start? At a local level, national level? Does it go up to the United Nations, or does it stay regional? That's really the big debate, because we are in a very interconnected world now. Governments have some decision-making processes, and we've seen this with the coronavirus. Some governments reacted some way, some have reacted other ways, and there's not a really cohesive idea. The WHO is, the WHO is the WHO. You can talk about the corruption or whatever you want in the WHO, but it's really the only global health body that we have, and therefore it's the only one that everyone will agree to listen to. So is that important? I think that's important. It's a forum, again, like the United Nations, where you can sit down around the table and talk about things. And that is very, very, very important, regardless of what people want to argue about global government or this and that. A forum where people can connect and talk is very, very important. And we wish all the best for the coronavirus people. Well, look, any closing statements? Ben, we've got your countdown. You've got 5 days left. Just quickly tell us, are you excited for your debate?
Oh, yeah. And I hope people tell your friends and loved ones in Chicago. There's going to be not one, but two life extensionists, myself and Zoltan Disfin, on the stage at this first ever debate event of its kind, the largest primary debate event ever to occur, and that's put on by the Free and Equal Election Foundation. If you're not able to be in Chicago, I would strongly urge you to be there, but you can check it out at freeandequal.org. You can watch it there, and on other media networks and channels that you have access to. And that's going to be an exciting event. I'm very much looking forward to that, and looking forward to hanging out with Zoltan and our futurist friends who are kind enough to make the trip. But you can also learn a little bit more about the event at benzion2020.com. Please go to transhumanist-party.org/membership and sign up, and consider the futurist New Deal for America, a truly humane and visionary economic policy and public policy set of initiatives that I think will stand out above the sort of right libertarian bickering on that stage that I'm anticipating.
All right, thanks for that, Ben. Thank you, Kevin, Kane, over there in America. I'm sorry about all the scene changes on screen. I apologize for that. I did accidentally delete myself. I was trying to readjust from Ben leaving, and I did that, so I apologize for that. But thank you, all your great insights. I do apologize for the on-screen changes. So thank you very much. 5 days to go, everybody. Anything you wanted to say, Kevin, before we leave?
I have to. So today we're launching in the Google Play Store. So if you want to protect yourself from those hacks and you want to use a more modern protocol for a private tunnel that's using post-quantum cryptography as defined by NIST in the Canada algorithms made it to phase 2, and we picked one to qualify it as post-quantum. We put a 5-year economic shelf life before 1,000 qubits for a quantum computer. So that is going in there. So they're ethical about the claim, and that is going in the Google Play Store today or tomorrow. So you can look forward to reducing the theft of your private and personal information, because the TLS encryption standard for VPNs is broken and unreliable.
Yes, I haven't.
AmbitVPN.com. AmbitVPN.com. Thank you.
AmbitVPN.com. Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. AmbitVPN.com. Thanks to Gennady Stolярov, thanks to David Shoemaker, and thanks to Mike DeVerde for all of your support as well. Always appreciate it. Again, apologize for the screen changes. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Kane. And we'll see you again next time on Detonation.
Let's do it again soon. Thanks, fellas.